Our scripture for this morning comes from the book of James, chapter 1, verses 12 through 15. Blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. When tempted, no one should say, God is tempting me, for God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death. Israel was born out of tragedy. Not modern Israel, I'm not getting into that today. I meant ancient Israel. Jacob, known as Israel, the nation's namesake, had quite a bit of trouble with his 12 sons. The youngest son was Joseph, who drew the ire of his 11 brothers and eventually his father by relaying his prophetic dreams, which propped him up above his family. His brothers were racked with jealousy, so much so that they threw him in a pit and told his father that they were dead, and eventually they sold him as a slave. Joseph found himself as a slave at the hands of Potiphar, an official of the Pharaoh of Egypt. Genesis 39 says that the Lord was with Joseph so that he prospered, so that Potiphar prospered, and prospered enough that he was able to rightly attribute his newfound success to the presence of Joseph being under his care. Joseph was indeed so blessed that according to Genesis 39:6, Potiphar left everything he had in Joseph's care. With Joseph in charge, he did not concern himself with anything except the food he ate. And with the subtle bluntness often seen in the Bible, the verse goes on to say, Now Joseph was well built and handsome, and after a while his master's wife took notice of Joseph and said, Come to bed with me. Joseph, of course, refused. He told her that because of him, Potiphar doesn't need to worry about anything in his house, that Potiphar had put everything in his house under his care except for Mrs. Potiphar. He asks her how he could do such a wicked thing and sin against God. Still, Mrs. Potiphar was insistent. She spoke to him every day, insisting that he come to bed with her. Steadfast in his refusal to betray his master and to sin against God, Mrs. Potiphar eventually accused him of assaulting her. Much like Joseph's brothers presented his clothes to their father as proof of his death, Mrs. Potiphar pulled Joseph's cloak off his back and presented it to her servants as evidence of his abuse. Potiphar, rightly outraged at this betrayal, took Joseph and threw him in prison, the very prison that housed the Pharaoh's prisoners. If ever there was a time to indulge in self-pity, then being imprisoned in a foreign land for a crime you didn't commit after being sold into slavery by your very brothers would be the time to do it. But that's not what today's hero does. Because even in the prison, the Lord was with him. Joseph was so skilled and responsible that the warden of the prison put him in charge of everyone interred within and for all that happened. Joseph was in prison for some time and eventually crossed paths with two men, the Pharaoh's cupbearer and the Pharaoh's baker, both of whom were imprisoned for some vague offense. Both had vivid dreams, the likes of which Joseph had when he was living with his brothers. Both came to Joseph, and Joseph interpreted their dreams for them, correctly telling the baker that the Pharaoh would kill him, and the cupbearer that he would be restored to his old position. Joseph asked the cupbearer only one thing, that he remembered Joseph when he was out of the big house, which he did, eventually, after 2 years. In fact, it took the Pharaoh himself having a set of nightmares and his wise men being unable to interpret them for the cupbearer to remember Joseph. Eventually, the cupbearer told Pharaoh of Joseph, and Pharaoh called Joseph into his chambers. When asked if he could interpret dreams, Joseph said, I cannot do it, but God will give the Pharaoh the answers he seeks. The Pharaoh then told Joseph his dreams, his terrible, terrible dreams. Joseph warned the Pharaoh that the dreams meant that a time of great prosperity would come upon Egypt for 7 years, the kind of abundance that gets written about in ancient texts. The prosperity was to be followed by 7 years of great and terrible famine. Joseph told Pharaoh that he should look for a wise and discerning man to watch over Egypt so that they could store the prosperous harvests in storehouses so that when the famine came, they could survive. Pharaoh agrees, and agrees so heartily that he again puts Joseph in charge of everything, this time over the entire land of Egypt, a position so high and lofty that only the Pharaoh himself was over Joseph. Joseph governs the land exceedingly well, gathering the bountiful crops of the next 7 years and storing them safely for redistribution in the coming famine. And the famine indeed came. The famine didn't just strike Egypt, but it struck the whole land. The famine even reached to Canaan, the land in which Joseph's brothers and father were living. It was this that brought Joseph's 12 brothers, including the young Benjamin, the new youngest, to Egypt in desperate need of food. Joseph, after testing his brothers, eventually revealed himself. His brothers were terrified, so afraid that their long-wronged brother would seek out revenge for having sold him to slavers so long ago. This was not Joseph's reaction. He was so overjoyed to see his brothers, so happy that they could reunite in peace. His brothers were still wary, though. So much so that when their father Jacob eventually died, they lied to Joseph again and told him that their father's dying wish was that Joseph forgive his brothers for treating him so badly. They even came before Joseph, throwing themselves down and said, "We are your slaves." I tell you this whole story for the full context of Joseph's reaction here. Genesis 50:19 through 21 reads, "But Joseph said to them, 'Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done here, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children.' And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them." My Bible at home reads, "What you meant for evil against me, God meant for good." Our passage for today opens by assuring us that blessed is the one who perseveres under trial, because having stood the test, that person will receive the crown of life that the Lord has promised to those who love him. That's the easy part of the verse. That's the part of the verse that you spray paint on the wall of the gym at the church, right next to Philippians 4:13, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me." And both verses mean more than a surface reading might make them seem. The verse goes on to say, "When tempted, no one should say, 'God is tempting me.' For God cannot be tempted by evil, nor does he tempt anyone. But each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is full grown, gives birth to death." It can be very easy when faced with temptations to say that God is tempting us, that he's bringing too great a test for us, so how could he expect us to resist these impossible temptations? This seems to be an especially valid critique in the face of stories such as Abraham, when God instructed him to sacrifice his only son, or even Jesus, when after his baptism at the hands of John, he was led by the Spirit to be tested by Satan. So we need to understand the linguistic difference between being tempted and being tested. There are two different words being used here. When Satan tempts someone, he is actively desiring that that person falls, that they succumb to sin and falter. The same is true of our own desires. They present an enticing sin and work in us all sorts of evil desires, not for our own good, but to draw us away from God. God would never tempt us with sin. When God tests us and puts us through trying times, it is for our own good, so that we may become stronger for having passed the test. When Joseph was enslaved, he was the best slave that he could be. When he was imprisoned, he was the best prisoner he could be. And when he was put in positions of power, he worked as well and as hard as he possibly could. He never played the victim. He never succumbed to self-pity. Wherever he was, he did everything he could to honor God. Joseph never said that God was tempting him to sin. He never rested in his horrible situation or used his circumstances as an excuse to give up. He always persevered under every trial brought to him. It was because of that the ancient Israelites were able to grow in Egypt and become the nation of Israel. What Joseph's brothers, Potiphar's wife, and the memory of the cupbearer meant for evil, God used for good. This is all very well in these individual circumstances, but it's important to remember that this extends beyond individual actions and circumstances. When humanity fell at creation and brought conscious evil into the world, it changed things. We are unique amongst the creatures of God's kingdom in that we can consciously choose to do evil. As we just discussed, God can take our evil actions and turn them towards good. But God is also at work in our lives, turning the evil in our heart towards His goodness. Joseph always attributed his abilities to God, which is good on the face of it, but it also points to the fact that when we endure once, we are able to endure better in the future. Endurance is a gift from God, given to us in the form of tests and trials, but never temptations. God gives us the ability to run the race and finish strong so that we may endure for His glory, and so that we may receive the crown of life that He has promised to those who love Him. Sin is not a part of that equation. James takes time to briefly discuss the nature of sin for a reason. I've heard it said that the devil benefits most when we don't believe in him, or some variation thereof. I don't believe that that's quite true. James says that each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desire and enticed. Then after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin, and sin, when full grown, gives birth to death. By this verse, sin is a wholly human concept. It is what happens when humanity misses the mark of perfection that God has set for us. Now, I do believe that there are spiritual tempters out there, that the devil seeks to destroy us, but we must acknowledge the serious danger that comes from our own flesh, that not all temptations come from outside spiritual forces. Temptations that come from the outside are difficult to face, most certainly. I'm sure we all know the strength of peer pressure. But temptations which come from within are so much more difficult to overcome because you know exactly how to lie to yourself. You know your greatest weaknesses, and you know how to exploit them, and there is no place that you can hide from yourself. There's more to it than that, though, because this is a very nuanced passage, and James takes an opportunity here to reflect on the teachings of Jesus when he says that each person is tempted when they are dragged away by their own evil desires and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. To be enticed, to be tempted, is not to sin. Jesus spoke often of sin and its nature, and his emphasis was always on the state of your heart, of your spirit, stating that even if you look on a person with lust, you have sinned. The nuance James brings in is important, because it's not just noticing that a person is beautiful, it's not just being angry that someone has wronged you that's sinful, it's dwelling on it. It's choosing to lust after a person, as Potiphar's wife did. It's choosing to simmer on your anger and to act on it like Joseph's brothers did. That is when one is dragged away by their evil desires. That is when desire has conceived and given birth to death. See, it's even reflected in the language. Conception takes two people, the desire and the person with the desire to consent and play along. The stakes here are death, and that's why it's so important. If we can simply shrug off our temptations onto God and blame Him for every hardship and say that it's all too much for mere mortals, then we can take no responsibility for our actions. But we are responsible for our actions, and we can choose either to make the most out of every situation and build life out of it, or turn to and indulge in sin and reap the rewards of death. God will do a great many things. He will bless us generously, but He will also test us. He will bring us to and through painful and difficult situations for our benefit, for the benefit of our loved ones, and even strangers. But with that, we can rest in two promises made in our passage for today. First, that in all our trials and temptations, we can rest in the assurance that God is on our side. That God will test us, but He will never tempt us with sin. He will never work to corrupt us or lead us to death. And second, that if we run the race with great perseverance, if we, like Joseph, take everything that comes, every blessing, every terrible circumstance as an opportunity to live the life that God has called us to, then we will be rewarded. That every struggle will be made worth it, that indeed a crown of life is promised to those who love Him, and in loving Him, do not surrender to sin. Amen.